by the state, but it is commemorated in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa every year. In India, there has been more vocal commemoration of this massacre. In Pakistan, it's been in bits and pieces. We had something at Lums, which I attended. There was a couple of panels at some literary festivals in Islamabad and Lahore, but that is it. That was done at the private level, not at the state level. And it's very interesting, because just a few months ago, we erected a statue of Ranjit Singh in the city. We want to remember him, because he was the last indigenous ruler of Punjab. That's excellent. Our former information minister wants to talk about the return of the Kohinoor, which is a very grand project. Good luck to him, because 6 countries are claiming the Kohinoor. But we don't want to commemorate a massacre which occurred in this very province, in the other heart of Punjab. One is in Lahore and the other is in Amritsar. So this is something very skewed, and I'll invite you to think about that. The skewed nature of this nationalist memory, what we want to remember and what we don't want to remember, and why we want to remember it. It's very, very skewed. Why I want to talk about the literary remembrance of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Why poetry, why prose? One culprit is, of course, the state of history which is being taught in this country. The state of history which is being taught in India, dare I say, and the state of history which is taught in Pakistan. I've taught history in this country at O levels, and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre is little more than a footnote. And when you teach it as bloodless events, you can't blame people for saying it's a boring, dry subject, because this is how I learned history. One king came, he murdered someone, he became powerful. Then another king came, he fought this battle, he went away, and then another king. This is how history is taught. It was completely bloodless, and of a very thin crust of the people, the upper class, because they are usually the ones who fight wars. We never get to know what happens to the losers, because they say history is written for the victors, right? So this is a very dull, very boring sort of history, and there have been quite a few history books written about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre this year. I can name you some references if you press me about it, maybe in the Q&A. But history is of course boring, and of course historians are limited by their disciplinary boundaries. They are not taught to think about a subject 50, 60 years after that event has happened. So even if you ask a historian about, you say, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, they will say, 100 years is not really a big time, let's wait for 50 more years. And, so there is a certain distance between an event which has happened 100 years ago and what the historian, when he will want to write about it. Whereas poems had begun to start being written about the massacre as soon as the massacre had ended in Amritsar. Poets were at work, novels were being written about it, stories were being written about it. So there is something in poetry and prose which evades the historian. It is where the and I've got nothing against historians, by the way. A lack of imagination, if you like. So as I will try to demonstrate, it is the poets and historians who really enhance our understanding of something as terrible as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Because they can see it's an alternative way of seeing history, an alternative history which is being offered here, in terms of poetry and prose. And what was happening? Let me talk a bit about the context. The First World War had taken place. It had ended. There was a big influenza epidemic which killed off quite a lot of people around the world. And obviously the British had asked, the Indians to enlist for their war effort in World War I. I think 70 to 80,000 Indian soldiers died in the First World War. There is no memorial to those soldiers, either in Britain or in India or in Pakistan. And for what? They were promised that home rule. Home rule was a very powerful slogan during that time. And of course, there were other events going on around the world. 1919, what happened in Jallianwala Bagh was not an isolated incident. It was a connected incident because there were uprisings taking place in almost every corner of the colonized world. Because the end of the World War had given rise to hopes. Democracy, rights, decolonization. The Paris Peace Conference took place in 1919. So every colonized nation was trying to get a place for their representatives at the Paris Peace Conference, including a certain Vietnamese gentleman called Ho Chi Minh, who rented a morning suit in Paris, and he thought, I'm going to meet President Wilson of the United States because he talks about democracy, 14 points, the Wilson program. But all these hopes were going to be dashed, There were uprisings in China, in Egypt, of course in India, and even in Canada, There was a Winnipeg general strike, which led to a massacre over there. So it's all connected, We should not think that we were the only people who were going through this terrible time. It was most places in the world, they were struck by this legacy of the First World War. So, the war ends, and instead of democracy, instead of home rule, what the people of India get is more draconian legislation, the Montagu Camps for reforms, which, and immediately, but no home rule, a limited form of government which was dominated by the colonizers, hardly an Indian representative on the council of the Montagu Camps for reforms. So, and draconian legislation, no appeal, no dalil, no vakil. This was the slogan. You have no right to an appeal. If you can get arrested without warrant. Maybe some of the things which are being done now in the name of democracy sound a bit more benign than what was happening 100 years ago, तो कोई अपील, कोई दलील और कोई वकील नहीं आपका होगा. You can be arrested for even a harmless thing like publishing a newspaper. So this was the atmosphere in which this whole incident occurred, And who were the central actors of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre? One was Governor O'Dwyer, who was the governor of Punjab. His name is often confused with General Dyer, who was the butcher of Amritsar. Please do not mistake. O'Dwyer was the governor of Punjab, and General Dyer was the guy who was put in charge, the martial law administrator of the Punjab in 1919. And A.W. Kitchen was the DC, the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar. So, Gandhi, who was a rising star of the Indian nationalist movement, was going to travel to Punjab because there was agitation. He had asked the Congress leaders, Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Kichlu, to organize the Congress resistance against these draconian acts. And it's very interesting because the British administration actually feared that the sun had finally set on the British Empire in 1919. They were very terrified, although the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar had assured O'Dwyer that there is nothing of the sort. There is no situation where the British Crown is going to be overthrown. These are just harmless, peaceful protesters who are protesting unarmed, But O'Dwyer would not be convinced. Sadat Hassan Manto, who is one of our great writers, he was, of course, born in 1911. He was a boy of 8 years old, and he grew up in Amritsar, while this whole tension leading up to the massacre was taking place. And he has given us some immortal stories about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. In fact, if you look at the if you look at his contemporaries, you look at Krishan Chander, you look at Ismail Chughta, you look at Rajinder Singh Bedi, these are all, and Ahmed Nadeem Kasmi, these are all the great short story writers of that time. They're all contemporaries. Sadat Hassan Manto has written the most short stories about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre because he grew up in Amritsar. The quarter where he grew up is called Jalliawalabagh because all his extended family, they were all lawyers, So the whole street where he grew up was known as Jalliawalabagh. Now he is a boy of 8 years old. And his first short story, Tamasha, it was his first short story. This actually talks about, it's based on his own sensibilities as an 8-year-old boy. This was the situation which was taking place in Amritsar, and British planes were dropping leaflets that do not go to Jallianwala Bagh on the 13th of April. Do not go, because if you go there, you will be responsible for the consequences. So this is a terrified boy who's reading this message dropped from a plane, and he's pestering his father, Ghulam Hasan, Abu, I am Tamasha jao kab hoga, because वो गोलियां बाहर चल रही हैं, तो उस बेचारे बच्चे को तो नहीं पता कि क्या हो रहा है. So his father is trying to tell him, तमाशे पे हम शाम को जाएंगे, hold on, just don't pester me. लेकिन जो तमाशा हो रहा है वो क्या हो रहा है? It is actually bullets being fired, people being killed. Many years later, one of his immortal short stories of Manto was 1919 की एक बात. और इसमें से आपको मैं कुछ पढ़ के बताना चाहूँगा कि क्या सिचुएशन थी इस वक्त अमृतसर में. ये 1919 की बात है भाईजान, जब रॉलेट एक्ट के खिलाफ सारे पंजाब में एजिटेशन हो रही थी. मैं अमृतसर की बात कर रहा हूँ. सर माइकल ओडवायर ने डिफेंस ऑफ इंडिया रूल्स के तहत गांधी जी का दाखिला पंजाब में बंद कर दिया था. वो उधर आ रहे थे कि बलवाल के मकाम पर इनको रोक लिया गया और गिरफ्तार करके वापस मुंबई भेज दिया गया. जहाँ तक मैं समझता हूँ भाईजान, अगर अंग्रेज ये गलती ना करता तो जलियांवाला बाग का हादसा इसकी हुक्मरानी की स्याह तारीख में ऐसे खूनी वर्ग का इजाफा कभी ना करता. क्या मुसलमान, क्या हिंदू, क्या सिख, सबके दिल में गांधी जी की बेहद इज्जत थी. सब इसे महात्मा मानते थे. जब इनकी गिरफ्तारी की खबर लाहौर पहुंची तो सारा कारोबार एकदम बंद हो गया. यहाँ से अमृतसर वालों को मालूम हुआ, चुनांचे चुटकियों में मुकम्मल हड़ताल हो गई. कहते हैं 19 अप्रैल की शाम को डॉक्टर सत्यापाल और डॉक्टर किचलू की जिलावतनी के अहकाम डिप्टी कमिश्नर को मिल गए थे. वो इनकी तामील के लिए तैयार नहीं था, इसलिए कि इसके ख्याल के मुताबिक अमृतसर में किसी हैजान खेज बात का खतरा नहीं था. लोग पुरअमन तरीके पर एहतजाजी जुलूस वगैरह करते थे जिनसे तशद्दुद का सवाल ही पैदा नहीं होता था. मैं अपनी आंखों देखा हाल बयान करता हूँ. 9 को रामनवमी थी. जुलूस निकला मगर मजाल है जो किसी ने हुकाम की मर्जी के खिलाफ एक कदम उठाया हो. लेकिन भाईजान सर माइकल अजीब ऊंची खोपड़ी का इंसान था. इसने डिप्टी कमिश्नर की एक ना सुनी. इस पर बस यही खौफ सवार था कि ये लीडर महात्मा गांधी के इशारे पर साम्राज्य का तख्ता उलटने के दर पे है, और जो हड़तालें हो रही हैं और जलसे मुनक्किद होते हैं, इनके पसे पर्दा यही साजिश काम कर रही है. डॉक्टर किचलू और डॉक्टर सत्यापाल की जिलावतनी की खबर आनन फानन शहर में आग की तरह फैल गई. दिल हर शख्स का मुकद्दर था. हर वक्त धड़का सा लगा रहता था कि कोई बहुत बड़ा हादसा बर्पा होने वाला है. लेकिन भाईजान जोश बहुत ज़्यादा था. कारोबार बंद थे. शहर कब्रिस्तान बना हुआ था, और इस कब्रिस्तान की खामोशी में भी एक शोर था. जब डॉक्टर किचलू और सत्यापाल की गिरफ्तारी की खबर आई तो लोग हजारों की तादाद में इकट्ठे हुए कि मिलकर डिप्टी कमिश्नर बहादुर के पास जाएं और अपने महबूब लीडरों की जिलावतनी के अहकाम मनसूख करने की दरख्वास्त करें. मगर वो ज़माना भाईजान दरख्वास्तें सुनने का नहीं था. सर माइकल जैसा फिरौन हाकिम आला था. इसने दरख्वास्त सुनना तो बुझा, लोगों के इस इज्तिमाही को गैर कानूनी करार दिया. हाँ, अमृतसर, वो अमृतसर जो कभी आज़ादी की तहरीक का सबसे बड़ा मरकज़ था, जिसके सीने पर जलियांवाला बाग जैसा काबिल फ़ख्र ज़ख्म था, आज किस हालत में है. लेकिन छोड़िए इस किस्से को. दिल को बहुत दुख होता है. लोग कहते हैं कि इस मुकद्दस शहर में जो कुछ आज से 5 वर्ष पहले हुआ, इसके जिम्मेदार भी अंग्रेज हैं. होगा بھائی جان، پر سچ پوچھیے تو اس لہو میں جو وہاں بہا ہے ہمارے اپنے ہی ہاتھ رنگے ہوئے نظر آتے ہیں۔ خیر، ڈپٹی کمشنر صاحب کا بنگلہ سول لائنز میں تھا۔ ہر بڑا افسر اور ہر بڑا ٹوڈی شہر کے اس الگ الگ حصے میں رہتا تھا۔ آپ نے امرتسر دیکھا ہے، آپ کو تو معلوم ہوگا کہ شہر اور سول لائنز کو ملانے والا ایک پل ہے جس پر سے گزر کر آدمی ٹھنڈی سڑک پر پہنچتا ہے جہاں حاکموں نے اپنے لیے یہ عارضی جنت بنائی ہوئی تھی۔ This is an eyewitness account of a boy who was called Sadat Hassan at that time, who had not become Manto, who was actually there and who was seeing what is happening in Amritsar. ہجوم اب ہال دروازے کے قریب پہنچا تو معلوم ہوا کہ پل پر گھڑ سوار گوروں کا پہرا ہے۔ ہجوم بالکل نہ رکا اور بڑھتا گیا۔ بھائی جان، میں اس میں شامل تھا۔ جوش کتنا تھا میں یہ بیان نہیں کر سکتا، لیکن سب نہتے تھے، کسی کے پاس ایک معمولی چھڑی پر بھی نہیں تھی۔ اصل میں وہ تو صرف اس قرض سے نکلے تھے کہ اجتماعی طور پر اتنی آواز حاکم شہر تک پہنچائیں اور اس سے درخواست کریں کہ ڈاکٹر کچلو اور ڈاکٹر ستیا پال کو غیر مشروط طور پر رہا کریں۔ ہجوم پل کی طرف بڑھتا رہا، لوگ قریب پہنچے تو گوروں نے فائر شروع کر دی۔ اس سے بھگدڑ مچ گئی۔ وہ گنتی میں صرف 20-25 تھے اور ہجوم سینکڑوں پر مشتمل تھا، لیکن بھائی جان گولی کی دہشت بہت ہوتی ہے۔ ایسی افراتفری پھیلی کہ علامہ کچھ گولیوں سے گھائل ہوئے اور کچھ بھگدڑ میں زخمی ہوئے۔ دائیں ہاتھ کو گندا نالا تھا، دھکا لگا تو میں اس میں گر پڑا۔ گولیاں چلنی بند ہوئیں تو میں نے اٹھ کر دیکھا ہجوم تتر بتر ہو چکا تھا۔ زخمی سڑک پر پڑے تھے اور پل پر گورے کھڑے ہنس رہے تھے۔ بھائی جان، مجھے قطعاً یاد نہیں کہ اس وقت میری دماغی حالت کس قسم کی تھی۔ میرا خیال ہے کہ میرے ہوش و حواس پوری طرح سلامت نہیں تھے۔ گندے نالے میں گرتے وقت تو قطعاً مجھے ہوش نہیں تھا۔ جب باہر نکلا تو جو حادثہ وقوع پذیر ہوا، اس کے خد و خال آہستہ آہستہ دماغ میں بننے شروع ہوئے۔ دور شور کی آواز سنائی دے رہی تھی، جیسے بہت سے لوگ غصے میں چیخ چلا رہے ہیں۔ میں گندا نالا عبور کر کے زہرا پیر کے تکیے سے ہوتا ہوا ہال دروازے کے پاس پہنچا تو دیکھا کہ 30-40 نوجوان جوش میں بھرے پتھر اٹھا اٹھا کر دروازے کے گھڑیال پر مار رہے ہیں۔ اس کا شیشہ ٹوٹ کر سڑک پر گرا تو ایک لڑکے نے باقیوں سے کہا، چلو ملکہ کا بت توڑے۔ دوسرے نے کہا، نہیں یار، کوتوالی کو آگ لگائی۔ تیسرے نے کہا، اور سارے بینکوں کو بھی۔ چوتھے نے ان کو روکا، ٹھہرو، اس سے کیا فائدہ ہوگا، چلو پل پر ان لوگوں کو ماری۔ میں نے ان کو پہچان لیا، یہ تھیلا کنجر تھا۔ نام محمد طفیل تھا، کنجر کے نام سے مشہور تھا، اس لیے کہ ایک طوائف کے وطن سے تھا۔ بڑا آوارہ تھا، چھوٹی عمر ہی میں اس کو جوئے اور شراب نوشی کی لت پڑ گئی تھی۔ اس کی 2 بہنیں شمشاد اور الماس اپنے وقت کی حسین ترین طوائفیں تھیں۔ شمشاد کا گلا بہت اچھا تھا، اس کا مجرا سننے کے لیے رئیس بڑی دور سے آتے تھے۔ دونوں اپنے بھائی کے کرتوتوں سے بہت نانا تھی۔ شہر میں مشہور تھا کہ انہوں نے اس کو ایک قسم کا آنکھ کا رکھا، پھر بھی وہ کسی نہ کسی ہیلے سے اپنی ضروریات کے لیے ان سے کچھ نہ کچھ وصول کر ہی لیتا تھا۔ ویسے بہت خوش پوش رہتا تھا، اچھا کھاتا، اچھا پیتا، بڑا نفاست پسند تھا۔ بزلہ سبزی اور لطیفہ گوئی مزاج میں کوٹ کوٹ کے بھری تھی۔ میراثیوں اور بھانڈوں کے شوقیانہ پن سے بہت دور رہتا تھا۔ لمبا قد، بھرے بھرے ہاتھ پاؤں، مضبوط کثرتی بدن، ناک نقشے کا بھی اچھا خاصا تھا۔ تو جو سڑکوں نے اس کی بات نہ سنی اور ملکہ کے بت کی طرف چلنے لگے۔ اس نے پھر ان سے کہا، میں نے کہا اب ضائع کرو جوش، ادھر آؤ میرے ساتھ، چلو ان گوروں کو ماریں جنہوں نے ہمارے بے قصور آدمیوں کی جان لی ہے اور انہیں زخمی کیا ہے۔ خدا کی قسم ہم مل کر ان سب کی گردن مروڑ سکتے ہیں، چلو۔ کچھ روانہ ہو چکے تھے، باقی رک گئے۔ تھیلا پل کی طرف بڑھا تو اس کے پیچھے پیچھے میں چلنے لگا۔ میں نے سوچا کہ ماں کے لیے لال بیکار ماں کی موت کے منہ میں جا رہے ہیں۔ سفارے کے پاس دھکا کھڑا تھا، وہیں سے میں نے تھیلے کو آواز دیا، مت جاؤ یار، کیوں اپنی اور ان کی جان کے پیچھے پڑے ہو۔ تھیلے نے ہی سن کر ایک عجیب سا کہا بلند کیا اور ان سے کہا، تھیلا صرف یہ بتانے چلا ہے کہ وہ گولیوں سے ڈرنے والا نہیں۔ پھر وہ اپنے ساتھیوں سے مخاطب ہوا، تم ڈرتے ہو تو واپس جا سکتے ہو۔ ایسے موقعوں پر بڑے ہوئے قدم الٹے کیسے ہو سکتے ہیں، اور پھر وہ بھی اس وقت جب لیڈر اپنی جان ہتھیلی پر رکھ کر آگے جا رہا ہو۔ تھیلے نے قدم تیز کیے تو اس کے ساتھیوں کو بھی کرنے پڑے۔ ہال دروازے سے پل کا فاصلہ کچھ زیادہ نہیں تھا، ہوگا کوئی 60-70 گز کے قریب۔ تھیلا سب سے آگے تھا، جہاں سے پل کے 2 رویا متوازی جنگلا شروع ہوتا ہے، وہاں سے 15-20 قدم کے فاصلے پر 2 گھڑ سوار گھوڑے کھڑے تھے۔ تھیلا نعرے لگاتا جب جنگلے کے آغاز کے پاس پہنچا تو فائر ہوا۔ میں سمجھا وہ گر پڑا ہے، لیکن دیکھا کہ وہ اسی طرح زندہ آگے بڑھ رہا ہے۔ اس کے باقی ساتھی ڈر کے مارے بھاگ اٹھے تھے۔ مڑ کر اس نے پیچھے دیکھا، چلایا، بھاگو نہیں، آؤ۔ اس کا منہ میری طرف تھا کہ ایک اور فائر ہوا۔ پلٹ کر اس نے گھوڑوں کی طرف دیکھا اور پیٹھ پر ہاتھ پھیرا۔ بھائی جان، نظر تو مجھے کچھ نہیں آنا چاہیے تھا، مگر میں نے دیکھا کہ اس کی سفید باسکی کی قمیض پر لال لال دھبے تھے اور وہ تیزی سے بڑھا جیسے زخمی شیر۔ ایک اور فائر ہوا اور وہ لڑکا آیا، مگر ایک دم مضبوط قدم کر کے وہ گھڑ سوار گھوڑے پر لپکا اور چشم زدن مرچ پہ جانے کیا ہوا۔ گھوڑے کی پیٹھ خالی تھی، گھوڑا زمین پر تھا اور تھیلا اس کے اوپر۔ دوسرے گھوڑے نے جو قریب تھا اور پہلے بوکھلا گیا تھا، بدکتے ہوئے گھوڑے کو روکا اور دھڑا دھڑ فائر شروع کر دی۔ اس کے بعد جو کچھ ہوا مجھے کچھ معلوم نہیں، میں وہاں فوارے کے پاس بے ہوش ہو کر گر پڑا۔ بھائی جان، مجھے ہوش آیا تو میں اپنے گھر تھا۔ چند پہچان کے آدمی مجھے وہاں سے اٹھا لائے تھے۔ ان کی زبانی معلوم ہوا کہ پل پر سے گولیاں کھا کر ہجوم مشتعل ہو گیا تھا۔ نتیجہ اس اشتعال کا یہ ہوا کہ ملکہ کے بت کو توڑنے کی کوشش کی گئی، ٹاؤن ہال اور 3 بینکوں کو آگ لگی اور 5 یا 6 یورپین مارے گئے۔ خوب لوٹ مچی۔ لوٹ کسوٹ کا انگریز افسروں کو اتنا خیال نہیں تھا۔ 5 یا 6 یورپین ہلاک ہوئے تھے۔ اس کا بدلہ لینے کے لیے چنانچہ جلیانوالہ باغ کا خونی حادثہ رونما ہوا۔ ڈپٹی کمشنر بہادر نے شہر کی باغ دوڑ جنرل ڈائر کے سپرد کر دی۔ چنانچہ جنرل صاحب نے 12 اپریل کو فوجیوں کے ساتھ شہر کے مختلف بازاروں میں مارچ کیا اور درجنوں بے گناہ آدمی گرفتار کیے۔ 13 کو جلیانوالہ باغ میں جلسہ ہوا۔ قریب 25,000 کا مجمع تھا۔ شام کے قریب جنرل ڈائر مسلح گرکھوں اور سکھوں کے ساتھ وہاں پہنچا اور نہتے آدمیوں پر گولیوں کی بارش شروع کر دی۔ اس وقت تو کسی کو نقصان جان کا ٹھیک اندازہ نہیں تھا، اور بعد میں جب تحقیق ہوئی تو پتہ چلا کہ 1,000 ہلاک ہوئے ہیں اور 3 یا 4,000 کے قریب زخمی۔ لیکن میں تھیلے کی بات کر رہا تھا۔ بھائی جان، دیکھیے، آپ کو بتا چکا ہوں، بے عیب ذات خدا کی ہے۔ مرحوم میں چاروں عیب شرعی، ملون گورے کی پہلی گولی بھی اسی کو لگی تھی۔ آواز سن کر جب اس نے پلٹ کر اپنے ساتھیوں کو دیکھا اور انہیں حوصلہ دلایا تو جوش کی حالت میں اس کو معلوم نہیں تھا کہ اس کی چھاتی میں گرم گرم سیسا اتر چکا ہے۔ دوسری گولی اس کی پیٹھ میں لگی، تیسری پھر سینے میں۔ میں نے دیکھا نہیں پر سنا ہے کہ جب تھیلے کی لاش گورے سے جدا کی گئی تو اس کے دونوں ہاتھ اس کی گردن میں اس بری طرح پیوست تھے کہ علیحدہ نہیں ہوتے تھے۔ گورا جہنم واصل ہو چکا تھا۔ دوسرے دن جب تھیلے کی لاش کفن دفن کے لیے اس کے گھر والوں کے سپرد کی گئی تو اس کا بدن گولیوں سے چھلنی ہو رہا تھا۔ دوسرے گورے نے تو اپنا پورا پستول اس پر خالی کر دیا تھا۔ میرا خیال ہے کہ اس وقت مرحوم کی روح قفس عنصری سے پرواز کر چکی تھی۔ اس شیطان کے بچے نے صرف اس کے مردہ جسم پر چاند ماری کی تھی۔ کہتے ہیں جب تھیلے کی لاش محلے میں پہنچی تو کوہرام مچ گیا۔ اپنی برادری میں وہ اتنا مقبول نہیں تھا، لیکن اس کی کیما لاش دیکھ کر سب دھاڑے مار مار کر رونے لگے۔ اس کی بہنیں شمشاد اور الماس تو بے ہوش ہو گئے۔ جب جنازہ اٹھا تو ان دونوں نے ایسے بیان کیے کہ سننے والے لہو کے آنسو روتے ہوئے۔ بھائی جان، میں نے کہیں پڑھا تھا کہ فرانس کے انقلاب میں پہلی گولی وہاں کی ایک ٹکھیائی ہڈی کو لگی تھی۔ مرحوم محمد طفیل ایک طوائف کا لڑکا تھا۔ انقلاب کی اس جدوجہد میں اس کے جو پہلی گولی لگی تھی وہ 10ویں تھی یا 50ویں۔ اس کے متعلق کسی نے بھی تحقیق نہیں کی، شاید اس لیے کہ سوسائٹی میں اس غریب کا کوئی رتبہ نہیں تھا۔ میں تو سمجھتا ہوں پنجاب کے اس خونی غسل میں نہانے والوں کی فہرست میں تھیلے کنجر کا نام و نشان تک بھی نہ ہوگا، اور یہ بھی کوئی پتہ نہیں کہ ایسی کوئی فہرست تیار بھی ہوئی کہ نہیں۔ The point of reading this extract is, of course, Sadat Hassan Manto, he was a boy of 8 years old when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre took place. In history or in literature, we seldom investigate an incident from the point of view of the marginalized people. We seldom talk about prostitutes. We don't talk about kids, We don't talk about, pimps. And if you look at the work of Sadat Hassan Manto, he has expressed unbridled sympathy with all these marginalized segments of society in his short stories. There is a legend that during the French Revolution of 1789, the first bullet fired was at the prostitute. So Sadat Hassan Manto borrows from that legend. Now, we don't know whether Tila Kanjar was a real person or not, but the fact that he uses this story to tell the story of someone who we don't regard as part of polite society is very significant. Similarly, our society is not a very child-oriented society, unlike in the West. These are bad times for children. You look at rapes, you look at sodomization, the incidents are on the rise. So when in Tamasha, which was the first short story which Manto wrote, when he is trying to crystallize the emotions of an 8-year-old boy, who actually he is young Sadat, he is actually expressing this alternative point of view, because even in that story, Ghulam Hassan Manto, the fictionalized father in the story, is trying to shut his son up, because he doesn't want his son to go outside and look at the tamasha. जो तमाशा हो रहा है वो क्या है? वो तमाशा जलियांवाला बाग का तमाशा है, जहाँ पे लोग उस वक्त मर रहे थे, तड़-तड़ गोलियाँ चल रही थी, 1000 लोग मारे जा रहे थे। जब वो बच्चा अपने बाप से उस कहानी में सवाल कर रहा है, अबू जान मुझे तमाशे में जाना है, मेरा स्कूल 4-5 दिन से बंद है, मेरा दोस्त मुझे मिलने नहीं आया, हमें पता नहीं स्कूल मास्टर साहब ने क्या कहा है, तो मुझे तमाशा तो आप देखने नहीं लेकर जाएंगे। तो his father, because of that message which has been dropped by the airplane, which is warning people that if you go to Jallianwala Bagh, you will be responsible for the consequences. So his father is terrified, and he is trying to tell his son to shut up and go and play and go and study. तो वो एक बच्चे के एहसासात को कहानी में, और बच्चों को हम अक्सर we never get to hear this whole story of children. So Sadat Hassan Manto, when he is writing these stories about Jallianwala Bagh, like Tamasha, like the story of Tila Kanjar, he is giving voice to the marginalized people, what they went through, And of course, for us, Tila Kanjar is honorable, because the notion of honor, who is honorable in our society? Certainly not Tila Kanjar, but in the hands of Manto, he becomes an honorable person, because he was at the front line of people who were shot for voicing out their demand for freedom. He wanted to take revenge from the British for killing so many innocent people. So this notion of honor and who is honorable or sharam, or ये Manto के यहाँ एक बड़ी skewed notion जो है वो हो जाती है. Similarly, what about the women? We normally don't get to hear about the women narratives. What happened to females? Because it's a very male-oriented narrative. If you look at some of the major poets and writers who have written about Jallianwala Bagh, there is a noticeable silence from the women, or what happened to the women. But there are women in the narrative of Jallianwala Bagh. For example, there is a woman called Raza Naeem, who is mentioned multiple times. If you read the poetry of Jallianwala Bagh massacre, if you read the novels and stories, who was Raza Naeem? Raza Naeem was a poor woman who happened to be in Jallianwala Bagh on that fateful day of 13 April 1919. It is said that the official inquiry which the British instituted, the Hunter Committee, this was the committee which was established to find out, to investigate, they said that some 350 odd people were killed. Then the Congress instituted its own committee under Motilal Nehru. They said that up to 1,000 people were killed in that massacre, because many people took refuge in the well. And when the bodies get killed, the well piles up. एक जिस्म के ऊपर दूसरा जिस्म, उसके ऊपर तीसरा जिस्म. So among the people who were killed were 41 children. The youngest was 6 weeks old, a baby, and The youngest boy was 7 months old. So Ratan Devi, when the carnage was over, because martial law regulation, there was a curfew. Even people could not go to the Bagh to look at people who had survived, take them to hospital or take the bodies to be buried in the graveyard. All civil liberties were suspended. So Ratan Devi stood there all night by the corpse of her husband, with a stick in her hand. Dogs were barking in the neighborhood. Jackals were coming to find their food. There was a buffalo who was groaning in pain in Jallianwala Bagh. There was a boy who was crying out saying, "Please don't leave me alone. I don't want to be left alone." So this was a landscape full of blood, people crying out for water, for first aid, and this woman called Ratan Devi standing there all night, standing guard over the corpse of her husband with a stick in her hand so that a jackal or a dog would not come and mutilate her husband's dead body. She stood there all night. No first aid, no hospital, curfew, martial law regulations, people crying out. And later on, when the government, the British government offered her compensation, she refused to take it. Like many of the people whose loved ones were affected and killed in the Jallianwala Bagh. So Ratan Devi is one heroine whose name has come down to us from the massacre. If you go to the Jallianwala Bagh museum in Amritsar, she is a very prominent heroine in that story. We talked about Manto. I'm going to move on now to another of Manto's contemporaries, the writer Krishan Chander, who is one of my favorite writers. Of course, he was a progressive writer, and he spent a lot of time in Lahore. He was educated from FC College. He did a master's in English literature from this college, and he migrated to India after partition. And he never came back to Lahore. Until his dying breath, he wanted to come back to Lahore because he loved Lahore. Some of his best friends like Manto lived in Lahore. He has written, a very horrible because if you read those stories, a collection of stories on the partition called Hum Vaishi Hain, and of course the title should tell you what people did, जो उस writing में हिंदू मुसलमान सिखों ने दूसरे के साथ किया, उसमें there's this story, about Amritsar, what happened to Amritsar at the time of Jallianwala Bagh and what happened to Amritsar after 1947 जब हमें आज़ादी मिल गई थी. तो वो एक कहानी है अमृतसर आज़ादी से पहले और फिर एक कहानी अमृतसर आज़ादी के बाद. So I have translated that story into English, and this is the book, which is actually the first book of its kind, because this talks about all of the literature which has been published about Jallianwala Bagh. You can find it in English, whether it's in Bengali, whether it's in Urdu, it's Punjabi, you can find it all in this book. And it gives you a perspective which is missing from history books, because there are some eyewitness stories here. So Krishan Chander in this story talks about some women who became heroes. Now we don't know whether they were real women or not, but maybe they were inspired by Ratan Devi, we don't know. So I'm going to read you this, what happens when women defy curfews, what happens when women decide to throw their lot in with the martyrs. I'm going to read you an extract from this story, Amritsar Azadi se pehle, Amritsar pre-independence. It was not curfew time yet. 4 women of Kucha Ramdas, 2 Muslim, 1 Sikh and 1 Hindu came to buy vegetables. They passed the front of the sacred Gurdwara. All of them paid their respects and, turning their faces away, busied themselves in buying vegetables. They had to return very soon. The curfew was about to begin, and the air echoed with the call of the martyr's blood. But still they got late while talking and buying provisions, and as they turned to leave, just a few minutes remained in the curfew. Begum said, "Come, let's go through this alley. We will be home well in time." Paro said, "But the Goras are on guard there." Sham Kaur replied, "And these Goras cannot be trusted." Zainab said, "But they won't bother the women. We will just pass with our veils drawn. Come quickly." All four women entered the alley. The soldier said, "Salute this flag. This is the Union Jack." The women saluted the flag, flustered. "Now get out of here immediately by crossing on your knees from here to there." The soldier said, pointing to the length of the road. "On our knees? We can't do this," Zainab said timidly. "Oh, you must crawl. The Sarkar's orders. Drag yourself on your knees." "We will go as we please," Shankar said proudly. "Let's see who dares to stop us." She began to walk. "Stop, stop," Paro said, petrified. "Stop, stop," the Gora said. "I will shoot." Shankar was walking straight. "Time!" A bullet whizzed past. Shankar fell. Zainab and Begum looked at each other, and then both of them fell on their knees. The Gora was pleased, thinking they were following the Sarkar's orders. Zainab and Begum fell on their knees, raised both their hands, and after a silence of a few moments, both stood up straight and began to cross the alley. The Gora was left stupefied, then his cheeks flickered with anger, and he straightened his rifle. Time! Time! 2 more bullets were shot. Paro began to cry. "Now I will too have to die. What misfortune! My husband, my children, my mother, my father, my brothers, please forgive me. Today I too will have to die. I don't want to die, but I still have to. I cannot leave my sisters to die alone." Paro advanced, crying. The Gora gently instructed her, "No need to cry, just follow the Sarkar's orders and cross this alley like this by falling on your knees. Then nobody will harm you." The Gora explained the manner of walking to her by himself falling on his knee. Paro came near the Gora, crying. The Gora now stood straight haughtily. Paro spat on his face forcefully and then, turning back, began to cross the alley. She was walking straight proudly in the center of the alley, and the Gora was looking at her with amazement. A few moments later, he straightened his gun, and Paro, who was the weakest and meekest of her friends, died ahead of everyone else. Paro, Zainab, Begum, Shankar, domestic women, veiled women, the very embodiment of virtue, crossed the dark alley of cruelty, carrying the love of their husbands and the milk of motherhood for their children in their bosoms. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, but their steps did not falter. Someone might have called out at that time with their love. Some little arms might have beckoned. Someone's charming smile might have been witnessed. But their spirit said, "No, today you will not bend. Today, after centuries, has come the moment when all of Hindustan has awakened and is crossing this alley proudly, advancing with its heads raised high." Zainab, Begum, Paro, Shankar. Who says the Sita in this country has died? Who says that no Sati Savitri is born any longer in this land? Today, every particle of this alley is resplendent with the divine blood of a martyr. Shankar, Zainab, Paro, Begum. Today, you yourselves have not crossed this alley with your heads raised. Today, your entire land is crossing this alley, its head raised with pride. Today, the raised flag of freedom is crossing this alley. Today the respectable traditions of your land, your culture, your religion have come alive. Today the head of humanity is raised with pride. 1,000, 1,000,000 salams on your spirits. So, this story actually, if we believe Krishan Chander, then actually women were the real heroes of Jallianwala Bagh. Because, there was the infamous crawling order. Right after, before the Jallianwala Bagh, the British asked this judge, Justice S.A.T. Rowlett, to pass this Rowlett bill. No dalil, no appeal, no vakil, but also, because there was rioting in the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre on 13 April, there was a street in Amritsar where a British woman, Marcella Sherwood, was assaulted. A white woman was assaulted by some ruffians. Her clothes were torn apart and she was almost naked, but she was rescued by some locals who lived in that area, and they hid her in their homes until it was safe to spirit her to this fort where all the remaining British families were being kept. So in that street, the British sought to take revenge. So they ordered that whoever is going to pass this street will have to crawl on their bellies, saluting the Union Jack, because we are going to teach the Indians a lesson. How dare the Indians, who are uncivilized savages, how dare they talk about civil liberties? Because we are here to teach them about civilization. How dare they assault a white woman in this street? So for the residents of that street, they wanted to set an example. So whoever was going to cross that street, if he had to crawl on his belly like a snake, and if he raised his head, then the British would start firing, so that the length would be matched. So in the street, residents could not go out. The garbage piled, it stank, but because of that order, no one went out into the street, no one came into the street. So this was the crawling order, which these four women, defied, about which Krishan Chander has so brilliantly and movingly depicted. This was the state of affairs in Jallianwala Bagh in the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Right. 13 April, 1650 rounds of fire were fought in a matter of 10 minutes. And the soldiers only stopped because they ran out of ammunition. No mercy, no respect, nothing. And that bar is closed from three sides, and the only way to go is a tiny exit which is guarded by British tanks. You can't get out, and the firing was directed at the densest part of the bar. Who were these people? These were people who were men, women, children, aged people, Sikhs, Muslims, Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus who were coming out, some of them, to celebrate Vaisakhi, which is the spring festival. You call it Basant, you call it Vaisakhi. They were coming out with their kids. Other people were unarmed. They wanted to make a statement. Totally peaceful, peace-loving crowd, unarmed. So General Dyer says, I want to teach these people a lesson, for defying my order. So without warning, he comes and closes off the exit with his tanks, and he orders the Gurkha soldiers to fire. And for firing went on for 10 minutes, as you can imagine, there was chaos, because after the front line had been killed, there was a stampede, because people wanted to get away, and there was no way to get away, so they trampled on each other, crushed each other, and there was this well, the well which is still there, and people hid inside the well, but then the bodies started piling. What do you do when you kill so many people that even the well is full of dead bodies? So curfew regulations were passed, and later on the Hunter Committee, which the British tasked the Hunter Committee to go to Amritsar and collect evidence and bring the people to court. So General Dyer, who was a field soldier, he was being considered to be promoted. Brigadier General was his temporary title. He was called up in front of the Hunter Committee, and he was asked to explain why he fired on thousands of peaceful people on that day, on April 13, 1919. And he said, I was just doing my duty. I was, I wanted to teach them a lesson. And he was asked, why didn't you give a warning, and why wasn't first aid or emergency equipment brought to the people who were dead and injured? He said, that was not my job, it was the job of the hospitals. Whoever was injured could have walked to the hospital himself, And this was a man. The Morning Post newspaper collected £30,000 to award him for his services to the British Empire, when he went back to London to face trial. And some of the members of the Conservative Party, they have just won the elections in Britain again. And the Imperial War Council wanted to collect, some funds to defend this man in court. And they recommended to the British Crown, please don't punish him too much, okay, fine, just retire him, and maybe you can give him half his pension, that's it. So General Dyer expressed no remorse for what he did on the 13th of April, 1919. And, he was let off very lightly. He was not promoted to Brigadier General, he was demoted to the rank of Colonel. He was stripped of his command, he was retired, but he was not tried, he was not punished. None of the main actors of the Jallianwala Bagh, and he was not considered for a promotion. And he died in 1927, a very, very vain man, a very lonely man. This is what inevitably happens to such people who kill people sometimes without remorse. So he died in his very small cottage, and he was suffering from arteriosclerosis. So there is no memorial stone in his memory. There is no plaque, no grave. If you ever wish to find out what happened to the gentleman, you will be. It's a vain mission. And his wife Annie was a very sensible woman, because she removed all traces of any sort of things in the family which would remind people that he was such a terrible man, and who had killed so many people. So if you ever happen to meet his grandchildren and ask them about their grandfather, they will have absolutely no knowledge and no memory of what General Dyer did on that day, on 13 April 1915. There were some other actors in Jallianwala Bagh. What happened to them? Michael O'Dwyer, who was the governor of Punjab, who escaped the proceedings of the Hunter Committee with his reputation intact, because he claimed that I had nothing to do with the massacre, it was the army which was in charge, I had nothing to do with the massacre. 1940, Mr. O'Dwyer, the former governor of Punjab during the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, he is coming out of Caxton Hall in London, and he is shot dead by a 31-year-old man who was a survivor of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He was 21 years old on the day when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre took place, and he waited 10 years to get his revenge for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So he meets Michael O'Dwyer outside Caxton Hall, and he shoots him. And obviously he's immediately arrested and he's put on trial. And this is, when he was asked why he did it. because I had a grudge against him. He deserved it. He was the real culprit. He wanted to crush the spirit of my people, so I have crushed him. I am not scared of death. I have seen my people starving in India under the British rule. What greater honor could be bestowed on me than death for the sake of my motherland? And when he was asked his name, he said, my name is Ram Muhammad Singh Azad, because he said that I am taking a revenge for the 3 people who were killed, Muslim, Hindus, and Sikhs, and I am Azad because I am free, I am answerable to no one. And when he was asked over which book he would like to get his oath, he said, bring me the Heer Waris Shah, because that is the book on which I am going to swear my oath. So he was a Punjabi nationalist and he was a patriot, and of course his name has survived in history. His name was Udham Singh, and he was hanged in Pentonville prison in July 1940. And many years later, in 1974, his ashes were brought from Pentonville prison because he was born in Kapurthala in Punjab. So one of his fellow MPs from there, he campaigned for many years to bring the ashes back to India. So he was buried as a national hero. He was given the title of Shaheed, Sardar Udham Singh Shaheed, and his ashes were reburied in an urn, which is now in Jallianwala Bagh, because all of the martyrs of Jallianwala Bagh, their ashes were burnt in an urn. And Udham Singh, of course, provided an inspiration to another 23-year-old man who was executed by the British Empire for daring to dream about freedom prematurely. And his name, of course, was Sardar Bhagat Singh, and we also call him Sardar Bhagat Singh Shaheed. And he was actually executed in this very city, not very far from here, in Shalman Chowk. And there are many people who say that that chowk should be renamed Sardar Bhagat Singh Shaheed Chowk. So next week, when maybe most of you are celebrating New Year, you should remember that the 120th birthday of Sardar Udham Singh Shaheed is going to be on the 28th of December. So maybe you will remember him because his birthday is a national holiday in Haryana, which is the province where he is now buried. There was another survivor of Jallianwala Bagh who, unlike Udham Singh, decided to become a writer. He only survived because he fainted when the firing took place. He fainted and bodies piled up, and he was given up for dead. So when the bodies were removed, he came to and he went back to his family, and he wrote. His name was Nanak Singh, and he went on to become one of the greatest Punjabi novelists of his generation. And he wrote a searing poem called Khooni Vaisakhi in 1920, just 1 year after this massacre took place. He crystallized his entire feeling of anger into that poem, Khooni Vaisakhi, and the British, being very helpful, immediately banned it, because it was selling like hotcakes. So it was banned, and people didn't talk about it. They burned all the copies, but like good British historians, the British always have one copy which they send to the British Library in London. So they're always good record keepers. So they sent one copy of that poem to the British Library in London, and of course Nanak Singh became a great novelist. He never mentioned the poem again. He mentioned in a very oblique way, and everyone forgot about the poem. Then many years later, when Gyani Zail Singh, who became the first Sikh president of India, he was a friend and admirer of Nanak Singh. He went to London using his offices, and he traced the one surviving copy of Khooni Vaisakhi. It was on microfilm. So he brought back that microfilm. The poem was republished in India after 60 years. After people thought it was lost forever, it was published, it was celebrated, it was translated into English, and this is what Nanak Singh says to General Dyer in the the final part of the poem. It's called the Martyr's Certificate to Die. Shame on you, you merciless dyer. What brought you to Punjab, O dyer? Not a sign of mercy unleashing such horror. How badly were you drunk, O dyer? You came here thirsting for our blood. Will a lake of it fill your greed, O dyer? So many innocents mowed down by you. The Almighty will demand answers, O dyer. You scoundrel who gave you the right to make mincemeat of our patriots, O dyer, wreaking terror upon us innocent folk. Did you fancy the taste of power, O dyer? Just as you riddled our bodies with bullets, you too will pay the price, O dyer. You will die and head straight to hell. Ah, such torment awaits you there, O dyer. Coming face to face on that judgment day, what answers do you plan to give, O dyer? You tyrant, until the end of time you will be called. The murderer that you are, O dyer. Our Lord will punish you for your crimes. Watch how you get destroyed, O dyer. Says Nanak Singh, which holy book allows for innocents to be butchered like this, O dyer? So, 100 years on, when we talk about General Dyer, now Dyer actually is physically gone, but Dyerism has not gone. Dyerism is a state of mind, you know. हम कहते हैं कि जी भुट्टो मर गया ऐसे आ सकता है, तो डायर भी फिजिकली तो मर गया बेचारा, लेकिन वो जो फीलिंग है डायरिज्म की, एंड दिस इज वेयर आई वांट टू कनेक्ट इट टू व्हाट इज हैपनिंग इन पाकिस्तान एंड इंडिया. कई लोग कहते थे, जिस तरह मुशर्रफ साहब के बारे में आज कह रहे हैं कि इनको फांसी पर चढ़ाया जाए, कई लोग 100 साल पहले जनरल डायर के बारे में भी कह रहे थे कि इसको फांसी पर क्यों नहीं चढ़ाया, इसको कोर्ट मार्शल क्यों नहीं किया, इसको. तो बात सिर्फ ये है कि यू नो अगर वो तो जनरल डायर तो जिस तरह की मौत जिसने मरनी थी वो मर गया, लेकिन यू नो whenever we talk about incidents like Jallianwala Bagh, whenever we talk about Dyer, we remember that those people who had come out of Jallianwala Bagh, they were innocent people who were celebrating, who were there for civil liberties, who were peacefully trying to express their right to assembly. और आज जब हमारी रियासत, आप स्टूडेंट मार्च की बात करें, आप औरत मार्च की बात, ये कौन लोग हैं? ये भी वही लोग हैं, ये वही लोग हैं. जब ये लोग अपने राइट्स की बात करते हैं तो इन पर हम दफा 420 अमेंडमेंट कर देते हैं, इन लोगों को पटिशंस करनी पड़ती हैं. ये लोग सिविल लिबर्टीज की बात कर रहे हैं, हम इनसे इंसान होने का हक छीन लेते हैं, हम इनसे स्टूडेंट होने का हक छीन लेते हैं, हम इनसे औरत होने का हक छीन लेते हैं. और ये कौन सी रियासत है? ये वही रियासत है जो जनरल डायर की रियासत से हमने इनहेरिट की है. So वो जो पैरेलल है, it is not just historical, the parallel is actually existing, so people who are, हमें किसी की इस बात से गर्ज नहीं है कि कोई किसी को फांसी दी जाए. Why can't you just take back all the जुर्मात हमने जनरल मुशर्रफ को दी? आपने एग्जाम्पल ही बनाना है ना. क्या जरूरी है कि उस शख्स से उसकी इंसानियत छीन दी जाए? Do the oppressors also have, do the people who are oppressed also have to behave like the oppressor? कि जिस तरह उसने हमारी इंसानियत छीन दी तो फांसी पे लटकाना क्यों जरूरी है? क्या हम ये नहीं कर सकते जो जनरल डायर के साथ हुआ? देखिए वो किस किस्म की मौत, जो गुमनामी की मौत है उससे बेहतर कोई मौत, वो उसको कोई जानता भी नहीं है आज, उसके अपने फैमिली वाले भी उसके नाम को छुपाते हैं. तो क्या ये जनरल मुशर्रफ के साथ हम नहीं कर सकते? वो पैरेलल ये है, फांसी पे लगाने से तो कुछ नहीं होगा, लेकिन क्या उसकी मराद उस शख्स से छीनी नहीं जा सकती? क्या उसको एक बेनाम मौत मरने का हक उसको नहीं दिए? तो ये जो पैरेलल है कि जो 100 साल पहले ये जो बात हुई थी, इट हैज़ वेरी रियल पैरेलल. एंड व्हाट इज हैपनिंग इन इंडिया अगेन, वो जो सिटीजनशिप अमेंडमेंट एक्ट है, हु आर द पीपल हु आर कमिंग आउट? दे आर ऑल हिंदूज, मुस्लिम्स, सिख्स, दलित्स. अगेन उसी किस्म की यूनिटी वो डिस्प्ले कर रहे हैं जो 100 साल पहले उस दिन वो डिस्प्ले कर रहे थे when they came out in droves. So our civil liberties are under attack. और जलियांवाला बाग में जो है स्टूडेंट मार्च में तो हम कह रहे हैं कि किसी ने आर्मी को नंगी गालियां दी थी, लेकिन उस दिन किसी ने भी जनरल डायर को गाली नहीं दी थी. किसी ने, वो तो डिप्टी कमिश्नर बहादुर को पिटीशन करने गए थे कि जी हमारे लीडर्स को छोड़ दें, तो उनके साथ क्या सलूक हुआ था? They did not deserve to die like that. So I will end, on this part, postcards of pain to the government. जो नानक सिंह ने जो है ये एक पोस्ट कार्ड भेजा था. By way of a gift, we got this diary, and all he knew was how to fire. So be it if God ordained, our postcards of pain, our innocent men sent off to jail, while hangings go up to a different scale. Please let them free is our refrain, our postcards of pain. O Lord, do listen to our prayer, your gentle flocks in utter despair, their tears flow without restraint, our postcards of pain. So I think when we choose to remember tragedies like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, because massacres continue to happen after that. The word genocide was not invented. This word was only invented when white men like Hitler killed fellow white men who were Jews. That is when the word woke up and they said, let's call it genocide. But these were unfortunate people that the word genocide was not coined. So I would just like to end my talk saying that when we remember the Jallianwala Bagh incident, we should remember that it was the first nail in the coffin of the British Empire. And as long as the question of civil liberties remain, as long as the question of censorship remains, as long as the question of democracy remains, people like Dyer, people like Musharraf, people like Zia, they will not go away. Thank you very much for your attention.